Throughout the United States, small pockets of intellectuals have become involved in a new and unusual philosophy which would seem to strike at the very roots of our society. Down through history, various political and philosophical movements have sprung up, but most of them have died. Some, however, like democracy or communism, take hold and affect the entire world. Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it Objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality.
Ayn Rand, born Alisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum in the St. Petersburg Governorate of the Russian Empire in 1905. She'd later flee the Bolshevik Revolution for America in the 1920s. She became a scriptwriter in New York, published plays and novels, and lived a controversial life. But why was this woman so controversial? If you ask people familiar with Ayn Rand's work, you'll get one of two answers. One would say that she was a visionary woman whose work ought to be revered. The other would say that she was a disgusting and heartless witch whose work is best forgotten. Some count her amongst the greatest philosophers of all time. Others consider her a mediocre novelist. My point being, there really doesn't seem to be any middle ground when it comes to Ayn Rand. Well, dear viewer, this might be my most controversial work yet. But I'm your favorite armchair philosopher, Mr. Minarchist. Join me in dissecting the ideas behind Objectivism. Would you kindly? Before we get into Objectivism and the controversies surrounding it, I felt it best that we first examine the life of Ayn Rand, particularly her early life, as it is essential to understanding how her later philosophical work came about. She was the eldest of 3 daughters in a Russian-Jewish middle-class family. Her father, Zinovy Zakharovich Rosenbaum, was a successful but humble pharmacist. When Ayn was 12 years old in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution began, uprooting her family's lives as the revolutionaries nationalized her father's business. On the brink of starvation, they fled to Crimea, at that time still held by the Imperial White Russians. But by 1921, they would return to St. Petersburg, or rather Petrograd, as it was renamed during World War I to de-Germanify it. Despite the new order gripping the Russian state, it's important to note that the leadership in the early Soviet Union under this guy was wildly different from this guy. Anyway, though life was highly regulated, Ayn, or rather called at this point in her life, Alisa, was very close with her sister Eleonora, and they both loved the cinema. Every ruble they saved was often spent on tickets to see the newest German or American silent motion picture. Ayn was absolutely enthralled by the romance of the setting of American skyscrapers, free metropolises, and all the ins and outs of the land of opportunity. She and her sister often dreamt of being actresses, and later in Ayn's life, she'd auditioned for all the newest silent pictures, giving us these wonderful headshots. Now, despite the Bolshevik Revolution nearly starving everyone and causing widespread mayhem, one would be remiss in assuming that there was no silver lining. Universities were now open to men and women, and Ayn jumped on the opportunity. Now, minor disclaimer here, this is where I condense several major events in her life in the interest of time. She enrolled in Petrograd University, studied history and philosophy. She hated that most philosophical subjects focused on Plato, as she much preferred the works of Aristotle. In fact, the works of Aristotle would be a major influence in her work. Regardless, she was also not very soft-spoken in her critiques of Soviet governance, which is why in 1924, after Lenin's death and the subsequent cracking down on free speech, Ayn's family began fearing for her life. They sold what little valuables they still had, and they'd send her away to live with relatives in the USA. This would ultimately be the last time she'd see her family. Once in America, she'd focus on assimilating to the culture, learning English and writing. She'd eventually catch the eye of famous New York director Cecil DeMille, and became a screenwriter. Met an actor named Frank O'Connor, married him, became a very successful writer, and later inspired and spearheaded the wider Objectivist movement. Now, if you want a more detailed look at her life, I'll be listing my sources in the description. Ayn Rand's philosophy is really just built upon the ideas of Aristotle, and what I mean by that is Rand effectively developed them thousands of years later for modern audiences. Allow me to explain. Objectivism holds that there is only one objective truth in existence, whether we're conscious of it or not. She argues the individual must possess a healthy skepticism regarding all things, that everything must be approached through reason, and that the pursuit of knowledge and happiness makes for a healthy existence. The truth and reality of all things exist beyond discovery, or consciousness. Aristotle would have approved. Now, despite her philosophical work, Rand was first and foremost a novelist, and because of that, she developed this philosophy in two ways. One way in which she did this was through her fictional works, namely Anthem, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. You don't count. The other being her non-fictional works, such as newsletters and essays. One such collection of essays is titled The Virtue of Selfishness. In my opinion, arguably the most important foundational work, but more on that later. Now, Objectivism's core tenets are rooted in rational egoism, and if you're unsure what egoism is, I did a pretty good video on it. Link in the description. But to sum it up, I think I'll just let her tell you.
Every man is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. He must exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others, nor sacrificing others to himself.
It is in her 1964 work, The Virtue of Selfishness, that she delves into the objectivist ethics. Or really, what defines objectivism. So, what do they really believe in? Well, this ought to do. Oh, can somebody kill the lights, please? That's better.
Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose
Objectivism.
Yeah, that's kind of the objectivist worldview in a nutshell. God, BioShock was a good one, wasn't it? Anyway, so Rand introduced her philosophy in her fictional works, and it was the popularity of her 1943 novel, The Fountainhead, that kick-started the interest, which was foundational to the later objectivist movement. And it was her 1957 magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, that solidified it. After this widespread popularity, she began work on the Objectivist newsletter, a magazine which heavily featured her worldview and her take on concurrent events. So, as I said before, her philosophical work can be divided between her fictional and non-fictional development. She would write 6 major works that all define the facets of objectivism. In Philosophy, Who Needs It, published in 1982, it defines the metaphysical aspects of objectivism. The concept of objective truth, or, well, as Rand put it,
Wishing won't make it so.
In the introduction to the objectivist epistemology, which Rand considered her most important philosophical work, it's about the value of reason, or, as she put it,
You can't eat your cake and have it too.
In my personal favorite, The Virtue of Selfishness, it explores the ethical aspects of objectivism and its code of rational egoism, or, as Rand would put it,
Man is an end in himself.
And in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, published in 1966, which is really just a collection of her political essays, well, she definitely puts it best.
Give me liberty or give me death.
And then there's her most important fictional works, The Fountainhead, published in 1943, which explores the aesthetics of objectivism. Atlas Shrugged, published in 1957, which I would consider the praxis of objectivism, or rather how objectivism might be put into practice as Rand herself saw it. Or, as Rand herself would say,
I'm better than you!
The question posed throughout the first half of Atlas Shrugged. Who is John Galt? In the case of The Fountainhead, who is Howard Rourke? Perhaps a better question is, what are the ideas they represent? Rand's characters like John Galt, or Howard Rourke, or Dagny Taggart, or even outside of the Randian canon, the antagonist of BioShock, Andrew Ryan. These figures represent, in her view, men and women of ability.
Have you read her? Rand. Atlas Shrugged. That's the one. When you hit 40, you realize you've met or seen every kind of person there is. And I know what kind you are. And you are a productive and reasonable man, and in the end, completely self-interested. It's strength. We are different.
These individuals of ability are what Rand considered the driving force of civilization. The idea of an uncompromising individual who is independent and pursues their own happiness self-productively. This is the rational egoism of Ayn Rand. Now, in my previous video on the subject of egoism, I contrasted Rand's version of rational egoism with Max Stirner's philosophy of total egoism. And Rand's egoism typically doesn't sit well with self-proclaimed egoists.
No! No!
Settle down, Stirnerites, I get it, Ayn Rand's a spook. Anyway, Rand reasoned that individuals of ability are the result of meritocracy, and that this is true progress, decrying so-called progressivism as the cause under which an altruistic and parasitic idealism destroys merit, and wishes to divide the conquered spoils of individuals of ability. Now, the opposite of an individual of ability is of course what Rand called intellectual thieves, looters, and parasites of industry. These people who are the envious mobs that wish to be handed everything, as Rand saw it.
That's right, for the good of the whole and sacrifice to the state. And whoever says it is or wants to be the state.
And given Rand's tumultuous upbringing, her witnessing the revolutionary Bolsheviks nationalizing her father's business, the labors of a self-made man confiscated under the guise and justification of a greater good, it is then not very surprising that this comprises a big chunk of the objectivist worldview. But her ideas weren't limited to this experience. She felt that the storied land of opportunity was going in the same direction as Russia did before the rise of Bolshevism. During the early 1930s, Ayn read about the death of Ivar Kruger, a Swedish businessman and match mogul. No, not like Match as in online dating. I mean the ones that they had to make PSAs about. Anyway, Kruger had committed suicide when his corruption was uncovered. Let's just say that his schemes were very triangular. However, Rand was increasingly confused by how all of the media outlets reporting about it seemed to have been criticizing his success rather than his dishonesty. The reason why I bring this up is because this was a foundational experience of Ayn Rand's when she began theorizing the ideal individual. And much like Kruger's story, she couldn't understand why Americans often reflected on past titans of industry as unethical robber barons, when in her view, these men of ability made America the industrial powerhouse it became. These figures were looked down upon by the established rich as, ugh, new money. And they were also looked down on by what Rand called ordinary men for how unfair it was that they achieved success, hence the term robber baron. However, for Ayn Rand, these figures were to be emulated. And I mean, she does have a bit of a point here. Take for example how Rand saw individuals of ability, and compare it with our modern portrayal of these figures as almost cartoonishly villainous. How they are always antagonistic in nearly every storyline. And she chalked all of this up to what she called the rise of the era of envy. More on that later. But how did Rand coat the fictional characters of her novels in her philosophy, and use them as examples of what she would call the ideal individual? Take, for example, Howard Rourke, the protagonist of The Fountainhead. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read The Fountainhead, just skip to here. But this character is an embodiment of Rand's philosophy, arguably more so than John Galt, but more on him later. Rourke is portrayed as a brilliant architect, a staunch individualist, and a man of artistic integrity.
I'm better than you!
He also has his flaws, amongst more modern audiences. 1943 was a different time. Anyway, he finds conflict in regards to those aforementioned parasites and looters who don't respect his artistic vision and wish to reap the rewards. He then destroys everything he built to preserve his integrity. And then there's John Galt. Again, spoiler alert if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, and again, just skip to here. But John Galt is similar. He's sick of government overreach and other such parasites.
I'm better than you!
And wishes to pursue success outside of a society which thinks they deserve a cut out of the fruits of his labors. You're getting the theme here, but that was Rand's picture of the ideal individual. But Rand's idea of the ideal individual is essential in understanding the objectivist worldview. The individual who lives rationally, independently, honestly, productively, with a sense of integrity, justice, and pride. Anyone who didn't possess these virtues of selfishness, Rand argued, had no business proclaiming themselves able individuals. Also, Rand would add that these individuals also must be conventionally attractive. Conventionally attractive by 1940s standards.
Get away from him, Phelps. This is my case.
Shut your fucking mouth!
Anyway, now the era of envy that Rand believed was consuming the free world, and she was somewhat prophetic in my own opinion, she felt meritocracy was being destroyed, that government was becoming engorged and tyrannical. No. She also saw the growth of the welfare state and other such social safety nets as wolves in sheep's clothing, preying upon an increasingly apathetic American populace with increasingly limited creative vision. She saw monopolies being propped up by government subsidy as a perversion of true capitalism as they weren't operating on their own merits. In short, the ideal man of ability is a Promethean figure. They need no fortune to inherit as they are more than capable of making their own.
I make my own luck.
Then there are the parasites of industry, the people who squander everything given to them, emphasis on given to them. They are typically arrogant, they are intellectually corrupt, and they rely upon utopian worldviews as justification for their actions. As Rand would put it,
and whoever says it is or wants to be the state.
And between them are the ordinary men, or the individuals of production, the workers of the world, so to speak. Those who probably don't get a fair deal, and if they get more than a fair deal by inheriting it, then they likely won't do anything spectacular with it. Rand would argue that these individuals lack a competitive edge. Honest enough not to be parasites, but content enough to not make waves or form a competitive edge. Those who clock in and out on the daily grind to provide for their families and hopefully look forward to a good retirement. An honorable existence, to be sure. An existence that most of us fulfill as blue collars. But nothing very extraordinary either.
It's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either.
I'm better than you!
Anyway, all of this is also why her work is often associated with the libertarian movement, despite her never officially associating with it. But we'll get to that later. After the success of The Fountainhead, and the subsequent movie, for people who don't like to read,
you must love the doing, not the people.
Rand was becoming popular. Far more popular, and much to the very later disdain of GQ contributors. The Objectivist movement was born. But it wasn't very organized. Despite Rand's very philosophical worldview, up to this point she was only a novelist, not a philosopher. Some would argue that she never was nor ever should be considered a philosopher. But she was catching the attention of scholars of philosophy and psychology, and they were hooked. Some more than others. More on that later. Anyway, it was the 1950s. America was enjoying its post-war economic boom.
I'm better than you!
The Cold War was cooling. Capitalism was capitalizing. Ayn Rand was randing. And figures like Nathaniel Branden and Leonard Peikoff would make their names, furthering the Objectivist movement, organizing Rand's ideas into a functional ideology. These two individuals were members of the Collective, an ironically named group of the self-proclaimed individualists inspired by Rand's work. The collective began as a small gathering of friends that camped out in Rand's living room and discussed philosophy, and this all started when Rand met Nathaniel Branden. Now, Branden started the Nathaniel Branden Institute, or NBI, with the purposes of spreading objectivism. So, for example, say Ayn Rand was a YouTuber of today. Well then, Branden was the merch guy. Which brings me to... Nah, I'm kidding, I don't have merch. But Rand sure did. So, you want tapes of her speeches? Well, Nate's got it. Newsletters and pamphlets? Yep, Nate's got it. Lectures and essays for your everyday objectivist? Nate's got it, and well, you get it. Rand's work galvanized the libertarian movement in the 1960s. Peikoff and Branden helped Rand's notion of the ideal individual blossom into the objectivist worldview. A worldview centered around the concept of objective reality, holding individualism as sacrosanct and viewing petty things like racism, big government, and other collectivist rhetoric as evil and totalitarian, as pure divide and conquer. And they of course pursued the belief in laissez-faire capitalism and the rights of life, liberty, and property. These were all the axioms of the objectivist identity. By the time the Objectivist newsletter began in 1961, the movement spread like wildfire. There were radio broadcasts, college campus clubs, and televised events all devoted to objectivism. The NBI even leased an entire floor of the Empire State Building. It was safe to say that Ayn Rand wasn't just a novelist anymore. She was a guest lecturer, an essayist, a public philosopher. And the Objectivist newsletter was being delivered to over 80 cities, growing the movement they had worked towards. It was no longer just the collective, and it was becoming just a wee bit culty. It got so bad that some of these so-called individualists began emulating Rand in nearly every way. They would furnish their houses like she would, dress like the characters in her novels. They would even wear similar accessories that Rand wore. Actually, some of them still do that. Some say they even began to speak like her when speaking about philosophy. Excuse me. Well, until the NBI closed down. We'll get to the debates within the objectivist movement in a bit, but Rand's biographer, Barbara Branden, described the closing in 1968 as a moment of total hysteria, as the movement seemingly grinded to a halt. Now, Rand had a very close relationship with Nathaniel Branden. A very close relationship. And after that ended, a massive schism broke out in the objectivist movement, with most supporting Rand, others remaining loyal to the NBI, but it would gradually degrade even more. In fact, by the late 60s, the libertarian movement as a whole would kind of grind to a halt, and it's not surprising that it did, as the libertarian movement focused on more idealistic issues. Thusly, Americans were becoming more polarized due to the more pragmatic issues laid out before them, and returning to the purely Democrat versus Republican dynamic, nearly ignoring libertarianism's existence. As for Ayn Rand and her objectivists, she would work with her intellectual heir, Leonard Peikoff, quickly dismissing the NBI as a distant memory. By the time The Fountainhead and then Atlas Shrugged was published, Rand had been a very public figure. But what about the spicier details of her life?
Let me add a little bit of spice to that.
Now, up to this point, we discussed Rand's early life up until her major publications, the rise of the objectivist movement, her recognition as a philosopher, and her transition from writing fiction to producing more philosophical works. After her time working in New York, she'd moved to California, where she continued working in Hollywood after Cecil DeMille had given her that big break.
I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille.
She'd met her husband, Frank O'Connor, during this time, and made an even bigger name for herself as a writer, so much so that they were able to buy a ranch in Central California. It would be around this time that she'd work on and publish The Fountainhead. Now, here's the thing about Frank O'Connor. He was soft-spoken, not particularly intellectual, had a vested interest in art, and was content with the simple lifestyle of running a ranch. Rand, however, was not very soft-spoken, missed life in New York City, and was determined to be considered an intellectual of her time, an ideal individual. So, when Rand met Nathaniel Branden, a very intellectual man and very similar to herself, they immediately struck up a friendship, and since they believed in voluntarism, in 1955, they both asked their respective spouses for permission to have an affair, which they both hesitantly consented to. Now, as we know, they went on to found the NBI, and Rand spent the 1960s as a public philosopher. And a public philosopher is essentially someone who doesn't hold a degree in philosophy and yet still contributes to a school of thought. Either way, this was in part due to Rand's distaste for universities, as she felt they were indoctrination stations that bred communists and parasites. You know what? I'm not touching that one. So, after her affair with Brandon, it ended less than amicably, with Rand immediately distancing her work from that of Brandon's. She was tearing down the NBI and taking her philosophy with her. This time, she began her work with Leonard Peikoff, whom she referred to as her intellectual heir. Peikoff himself would later write that the split with the Brandons was the first of many schisms the Objectivist movement would have to face in the coming years. Anyway, it was the 1970s. Hippies were running amok and big government was destroying the nation. At least there was a good soundtrack to the chaos, but Rand was growing older, and at this point she simply worked on the Objectivist newsletter. Instead, Leonard Peikoff was at the wheel, taking up where Brandon left off. Now, it's safe to say that Rand hated the 1970s. She often compared it to the decline of the Roman Empire. She hated the state of the culture, and remarked that the era of envy had taken over. That the welfare state was unavoidable. That everyone was busily engaged in coupling their cars to the gravy train, and that they had become too cynical to become able individuals, and yet she still maintained her hope. And it is due to her work in this stage of her life that the Objectivist movement was saved. And after her husband Frank had died, her days were unfortunately numbered. She had lost a great deal of her luster. She had also been diagnosed with lung cancer, and despite the pleas of those close to her, she was adamant that she not accept the help of any state health insurance, determined not to be a parasite, to remain independent to the very end. However, once it was evident that she'd be ruined should she carry on this way, she'd begrudgingly apply. And in my personal opinion, hell, she paid for it. She didn't have any choice but to pay into it, and several sources from the time say that this is how she reasoned with accepting it. Ayn Rand would ultimately die in 1982, and it would be up to her intellectual heir, Leonard Peikoff, to prop up Objectivism.
Is there still hope for salvaging our free system?
Yes, there is hope so long as there is one man left living on earth.
Now, Ayn Rand had quite the life story, regardless of the love or hate surrounding her legacy. Not many of us leave a legacy that's ingrained upon a working philosophy. So, up to this point, we've explored the life of Ayn Rand, the rise of the Objectivist movement, and the concepts of men of ability, ordinary men, and parasites of industry and intellect. But what are the politics behind this philosophy? You know, aside from laissez-faire capitalism. Now, earlier I mentioned that Rand's Objectivism has a great deal in common with the various facets of Libertarianism, but that she never actively associated with it. In fact, in some ways, she outright dismissed it as pure anarchism, even once regarding it as a threat to liberty, and also referring to them as not true defenders of capitalism, and nothing more than publicity seekers who plagiarize her work. Now, the major reason why the Objectivist movement doesn't associate with the libertarian movements is purely due to the philosophical, which is to say that despite the overlay with both of their ideals, libertarianism is purely a political ideology, which is bolstered by some general classically liberal philosophies. But Objectivism is purely a philosophy, formulating a worldview and a set of values outside of the realm of simple politics. Here's an example of that overlay of values. Objectivism has for itself a distinct code of ethics, and in libertarianism, this is a bit more loosely defined. And this is exactly why Rand disliked libertarianism. She viewed libertarians as immoral libertines that only held similar views of limited government and individualism because the concept of could is more important to libertarians than the concept of should. Whereas objectivists would of course say, just because you could doesn't mean you should. Also,
I'm better than you!
Anyway, Rand called this dichotomy objectivism versus subjectivism, and the differences go on. Libertarians consider individualism sacrosanct for different reasons than objectivists do. For objectivists, this is purely grounded in reason. In their worldview, the state is seen as an irrational abstraction that cannot possibly possess reason as human beings can, and that is why they believe that the only valid system of governance is one which leaves the fate of the individual purely under the control of that individual. Whereas libertarianism generally, and when I say generally, there should be like 6 asterisks there, only views the state as existing under the classically liberal idea of the social contract. The best simplification I can illustrate here is Aristotle gave way to Rand's Objectivism, whereas John Locke, Adam Smith, and Montesquieu gave rise to classical liberalism and thus libertarianism. Kinda. And in the socioeconomic sense, libertarians generally, again like 6 asterisks, believe in the concept of laissez-faire capitalism as a simple economic system that ought to be employed. Mind you, some libertarians don't, and if you're curious about those asterisks, I did a whole video comparing the different versions of libertarianism. Check it out. After this, of course. Link in the description below. Objectivists, however, don't see the simple pragmatic value of laissez-faire capitalism. They see it as the only moral economic system, posing a more philosophical analysis. There are a great number of objectivist principles in regards to politics outside of the libertarian debates that really deserve their own videos dedicated to them, but to sum them up, they all obviously pertain to that objectivist worldview we covered earlier. Such as their rejection of the primitive. Essentially, this is the belief that tribalism is irrational and foolish, and that advancing civilization is far more important and ought to be revered. Whereas primitive ways of life ought to be forgotten. And there is, of course, its endorsement of reason over mysticism, essentially atheism. Now, while objectivists don't disparage religious people from joining their movements or forbid individuals from valuing religion, they simply consider it a waste of time. And this is why Rand didn't like conservatives, as they were far too religious in her eyes. And they considered capitalism a necessary evil rather than a moral practice, which Rand criticized as being in line with Soviet ideals. Either way, there's more to this iceberg, and I'm not just going to throw away my video ideas all at once. Anyway, now, while I've poked fun at objectivists, Yes, you're better than me. I might add that my politics are very much rooted in a mix of idealistic fervor and yet sobering pragmatism, because I find that the objectivist ethics are quite inspiring. I'll interject my own views later, but I'd simply be remiss not to say that. So, now that you get the idea of what objectivists are generally on about, this gives rise to our next chapter. Now, as we know, upon Rand's death, Leonard Peikoff inherited her estate and began where she had left off. He produced a series of lectures called Understanding Objectivism, with the purpose of expanding the movement amongst larger audiences, and to bring about Rand's vision of individualism. Anyway, it was the 1980s, and it was the dream decade of any objectivist. Well, any objectivist that wasn't alive in the 1920s. However, it was a huge leap from the depressing sentiments of the 1970s. The 1980s heralded a return of that good old American optimism. It was a time of materialism, of egotism, of bull markets, of change. And that then begs the question, does Ayn Rand's worldview of the early to mid-20th century fit the changing world it now found itself in? While Peikoff thought so, he felt Rand's worldview was airtight, but not every objectivist felt the same. By 1989, the cracks were beginning to show, and it all started with the Peikoff-Kelley split. Starting with a series of small disagreements centered upon the work of a philosopher associated with the Ayn Rand Institute, or ARI, named David Kelley. Kelley had given a speech at an event held by Laissez-Faire Books, a libertarian bookseller. This then triggered shockwaves across the whole objectivist movement, as Kelley was criticized mercilessly, and many objectivists claimed that Kelley had foregone the objectivist virtue of integrity for having associated with what Rand called subjectivists, as we saw in the previous chapter. Now, Kelley was in deep doo-doo for a perceived flouting of the objectivist moral principle of sanction, which is a concept held by the philosophy that dictates it is acting against one's sense of integrity when associating with or giving legitimacy to actions, people, or ideas considered immoral. Now, here's the thing. Kelley asserts that he disagreed with the burgeoning concept of an orthodox objectivism, and maintains that Ayn Rand's ideas ought to be propagated amongst an even wider audience. even going so far as to still entertain the ideas of Nathaniel and Barbara Brandon, with the latter's work, The Passion of Ayn Rand, being sold by laissez-faire books, which most objectivists considered damaging and defamatory. They also sold libertarian and anarchistic literature, which was also a no-no. Kelley would respond to the growing disdain by publishing an essay titled A Question of Sanction, in which he basically says that he's an individualist, and that Rand was an individualist, and that the principle of sanction is purely up to the individual to decide. It was at this point that Peikoff would intervene and declared that Kelley would indeed be correct if the ideas he was associating with the subjectivists was not Rand's own work, citing his actions as intellectual thievery. Peikoff also maintained that most unobjectivist philosophies were inherently dishonest. Peikoff then maintained, more or less, that Kelley had flouted the virtue of integrity, but by then the fire had started. A number of objectivists had begun to side with Kelley, others stuck by Peikoff's interpretation. Peikoff would eventually make his point very clear, stating, "If you agree with the Brandon or Kelley viewpoint or anything resembling it, please drop out of our movement, drop Ayn Rand, leave objectivism alone. We do not want you, and Ayn Rand would not have wanted you either." With this, yet another schism had concluded. Kelley would ultimately break off and form the Atlas Society, and Peikoff would bolster the ARI. And so if you're familiar with any of these entities and were curious as to why they were separate, this is indeed why. This is how objectivism is presented in the modern day. Well, dear viewer, that was an introduction to objectivism. So, are the controversial ideas of Ayn Rand misguided? Or are they much-needed harsh truths? Was David Kelley right in his belief that objectivism is a philosophy that must continue to be expanded upon? Or was Peikoff's orthodox objectivism, in which Rand's personal ideas are held as sacred, indeed what was best for the movement? Well, I ultimately leave these questions at your feet, but please share your own thoughts in the comments below. As for me, well, I feel that I presented objectivism accurately, but given how many jokes I made at the movement's expense, many can perceive this video as a critical examination, or, given my obvious political beliefs and my admittedly biased takes, this video can be seen as a love letter to Ayn Rand. However, this is my take. Rand's views are incredibly similar to my own minarchistic and classically liberal sensibilities. Yes, it's true, but I find myself somewhat torn between the Peikoff-Kelley debate. Whereas I could see how Peikoff would keep a closed view, be it due to his own sense of objectivism or from a sense of loyalty, it wouldn't be hard to believe it's what Rand herself would have wanted, given her uncompromising nature and her stalwart integrity, two things that are intrinsic to understanding the person of Ayn Rand and her philosophy. That being said, one would be remiss if they didn't note the fact that David Kelley definitely observes his own individualistic interpretation of the virtue of integrity, having been uncompromising himself in what he felt to be what was best for the movement. However, there exists here an objective truth. There is no living your own truth, and perhaps only one of them are right. I would, however, consider myself perhaps, again, asterisks, a diet objectivist, if not conforming to the exact definitions. But I'd like to think that Ayn Rand wouldn't have wanted conformity. Individualism is indeed sacrosanct. But I must then add that I am horribly undereducated regarding the various interpretations of Ayn Rand and her work, and I am in the process of making plans to contact both the ARI and the Atlas Society to further explore these concepts. And in the exploration of these concepts, well, more videos will be released, because I hold Ayn Rand to have been a visionary philosopher. Yes, a philosopher. And, love her or hate her, I feel her ideas hold merit, that they are unable to be ignored, and that they really shouldn't be. I may not be an example of an ideal individual, but I don't think it's wrong to try to emulate the concept. I think we could all learn from her vision. I'll definitely continue to examine her ideas, and it's very safe to say, I like Ayn Rand. And again, let me know your own interpretations of the interpretations of objectivism in the comments down below. Anyway, dear viewer, I'll leave you to digest what I hope has been a thought-provoking video. This has been Mr. Minarchist, and whether you vehemently disagree or wholeheartedly agree with the ideas I've presented, or if you find yourself somewhere in between, keep your heads on a swivel. It's a big, big world out there. Oh, also,
I'm better than you!